In this lesson, we're going to talk about Zbrush To Keyshot. Now, Keyshot is a third-party rendering program. That means it's not produced by Pixelogic. It's a separate program that you have to purchase if you want to use it. Keyshot is just a rendering tool. It does very high-quality renders using HDRI imagery, and as well as allowing you to create your own lighting and then generate an HDRI from that. It's really a powerful rendering tool, and it's a staple of my own personal workflow when doing creature concept and character work. Now, ZBrush has produced something called the Zbrush To Keyshot Bridge, and that is a program that allows you to render ZBrush tools in Keyshot. It'll transfer over materials, it'll transfer over fiber mesh, it will even transfer over your ZBrush camera if you've got the perspective button turned on. Now, Keyshot also exports FBX files, so you could always go to Z plugin FBX import export, and you could export an FBX file from Keyshot and then bring your Keyshot camera into ZBrush. So there's a lot of portability going back and forth between the two programs. And of course, you could export OBJs from ZBrush and import them directly into Keyshot if you didn't have the bridge. But to follow this tutorial, you must at least have Keyshot. And if you do have Keyshot, it warrants purchasing the Keyshot bridge, which is not very expensive, and it's available from the Pixelogic website. You can also get various levels of Keyshot. You could get a ZBrush basic Keyshot version, or you can get the educational license of Keyshot or the full version. So to use Keyshot, we go to the rendering menu, and under external renderer, make sure Keyshot is turned on. Here we have the option to set our max faces. There is auto merge, you can group by materials, and you could also send the document color from ZBrush. Now, I don't change any of these settings. I simply turn on Keyshot, and that's what I use. I also turn off perspective because I don't want to send my ZBrush camera to Keyshot. Generally, I do all of my rendering in Keyshot on its own, and I'll set up my cameras there. For this tool, the Bogey Lady, we have the character with poly painting, and Keyshot will pick up the poly paint and render the poly paint. I have the teeth with poly paint. I have the eyes, which consist of two different subtools. I have the outer shell, which we will put a glass shader on, and the inner shell, which gives us the cornea, or the iris and the pupil. And then I've got fiber mesh objects for the eyelashes. Now, Keyshot will read fiber mesh as well. Now, everything that is visible here will transfer over, so make sure all of your subtools are visible and then click the BPR button. And since Keyshot is turned on, it's going to automatically load Keyshot. Here you can see it loading the program. And it's going to give me this little welcome to Keyshot menu here. We'll close that out, and now it's receiving the files from ZBrush. See, it's receiving the fiber meshes, merging the parts. Now here we see our object has come into Keyshot, and you'll notice that the direction is flipped from what we might expect, because we were looking down the Z-axis at our character in ZBrush, but we're looking the opposite direction in Keyshot. That's an important thing to keep in mind. I'm going to maximize the window here, and the first thing I'm going to do is set my CPU usage to probably 25% for right now, because Keyshot is constantly rendering this preview window, so that will slow down my interactivity right now. I've got performance mode turned on as well, so it's not doing any of the bells and whistles for the render, it's just giving me the basic view. So we'll leave this on while we take a look at the Keyshot interface. On the left-hand side, I've got my libraries of textures, environments, backgrounds, and materials. Material probably being the most important one to utilize, because that's where we drag all of our materials off. Now, ZBrush will send over materials, including matte caps, so bear that in mind. On the right-hand side, we have our scene controls here. If I go to scene, you can see there are my model sets, and if I expand that, they're all the tools that came across from ZBrush. And if I mouse over them, I can get a little preview. Those are the teeth. If we mouse down, I can get the next object down. Those are the eyes, etc., etc., eyelashes. Then there is the head itself. Now, I have my interface set to gray. You can adjust your interface to light or dark. And I have the heads-up display here, which will give me an idea of my samples, as well as the number of triangles, resolution, focal length of my camera, and whatnot. So to begin with, we want to adjust our environment settings, because remember, ZBrush has sent this over at the current scale inside of ZBrush, and it's also sent it over in its ZBrush orientation, which is actually facing away from us. Now, we don't want to move around the object because that's going to throw the relationship to the environment. So let's set our environment first. I'm going to go to the environment setting here. And here I can change my environment. Right now, these are the studio environments. I can go to outdoor, and there's some outdoor environments. Maybe I'll take this, what's a good one here? There's a nice interior. If I go to interior, there's a nice warehouse here. So there we go, the storehouse. If I click and drag that and drop it in the background, that place is the storehouse. Now you can already see the object is quite small comparatively. Now, I am going to, if I were to rotate around the character, and we rotate just by clicking and dragging on the background, it's going to change the relationship of the camera to the lighting on the background here. So what I will do is I'll go to my environment here, and I will go to my rotation, and I'm going to rotate this 180 degrees. Now the light is coming from behind the camera. It's a bit more acceptable kind of lighting that we're getting. Now I want to rotate the object. I'll go to Scene, and I'll select the ZBrush group here, and I'll go to Position and just select the Move tool. And I can rotate using this gizmo manually, just like this. I could also scale if I turn on Scale. That gives me a scale handle here, so I can click that Scale option and then scale the whole character up like this. I'll show you in a moment how we can actually send a scaled object to Keyshot using a plugin. But for now, this should be good. I'll click OK. And then I will just click and drag and try and get a nice look for this, or framing for this character. Now I'm going to go to Image. We have to set our image sizing. Now, because in Keyshot, this is a preview render window, it's going to be rendering in this window all the time. We need to make sure that our render window matches up to our final render settings, so what we see on screen corresponds with what we render when we do a final render in Keyshot. So I'm going to go to my presets here, go to Landscape, and I want to set this to 1920 by 1080. Now you'll notice that the options here don't actually change. They don't update to 1920 by 1080. That's because this window will stay at a proportion that it can actually show based on 1920 by 1080. However, if I go to Window, or excuse me, go to Render, open the Render menu here, go to Output, see my preset is 1920 by 1080. So this is going to be my final render size. By keeping the image window consistently in that same ratio, then what I frame here is going to be consistent with what I render in my final image, even though it's not giving me a preview render at that full resolution. So let's get a nice framing on here. Now I will turn off performance mode, and it will start rendering those surfaces in real time. So let's change our materials. I'm going to go to the material menu here, and now I have a custom menu here for COVID Demoni. These are materials that I customized for that particular project. I also have a custom material menu called Matty Monster with some of my favorite custom materials. You won't have these, so what I will do is I'll show you how to set up materials from scratch. If we come down here to translucent, we will find our translucent human skin materials. I'll grab human skin 150 millimeter. And I'm going to drag it over to the window, and I'm going to hold it over the skin of the creature. Now you see there's a tooltip that says hold Alt to retain textures. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and then let go of that material, and that's going to preserve the poly paint. If you don't do that, it will replace your poly paint and those textures will go away. So make sure you hold down the Alt key when you drag that over. Now I'm going to go to my environment here, and I want to adjust my brightness a little bit. Let's turn this up so we get a little bit more light on the subject, like so. Now I want to adjust some of the settings on the skin, so I'll double click the creature, and that brings up the materials for the human skin here. So I've got my surface color, my subsurface color, and the translucency settings. So if I take the translucency, right now it's set to 0.05, and this is scale dependent. This will be different depending on your object scale, which is one reason why we might find it valuable to send over a scaled object to Keyshot rather than the ZBrush scale. If I set this very high, let's say I set this to 5, the translucency is going to change. And my CPU usage is currently set to 25%. So if I turn this up to 50%, it'll speed up the render, and it's going to give me a better look faster. So it's constantly rendering in this window as long as performance mode is turned off. I can turn this up to 75% and it'll go even faster. If I change my translucency to 10, that increases even more. If we go to our environment lighting, and let's turn up the brightness on our environment a bit more so we can see. There we go. Now I can always change my environment by going back to my environment library here. Let's go to the outdoor, and let's grab a really bright outdoor one, the village lawn. If I click and drag that, now there's the village lawn, and I can see the hotspot here for the background. If I click and drag on the background, I can rotate my environment and change where that lighting direction is coming from. So we rotate around here. There we go. I can change that lighting. I can turn that brightness up. Now I'm going to go to my camera settings. Now, right now I'm on the free camera, and that camera can be changed easily. I'm going to click New Camera, and that's going to duplicate the camera, and I'm going to call this Shot Camera. And then I'm going to lock it by clicking the lock button here. Now I cannot move this camera, and I can always return to it. If I unlock it, I can come down here and change things like the perspective focal length. So maybe I want it to be a bit more dramatic, so I'll turn down the focal length on it, like this. Then I will lock that camera again. If I go to my environment, I can change my environment size. I can bring the size down, like this. Or I can turn the size up. And I can change the rotation, which does, once again, change the lighting position as seen on the creature. That's the same as holding down the Control key and clicking and dragging in the background to adjust that. Now, I'm going to double-click the creature again. That brings us back to our material settings here. And there's a neat little trick that you can do that's not very well known. If I go into Textures, and here you see I've got a color texture associated with the creature. If I click Upgrade to New Node right here, this gives me the ability to turn off the matte cap. The matte cap is coming from ZBrush. If I turn this off, it will retain the poly paint, but now that subsurface is far, far more apparent. I really like doing this when I'm trying to render skin. So now I'm going to go back to my main material settings, and I can adjust this translucency. If we bring this back down to 5, for example, it starts to get a little bit more manageable. Take it down to 2. There we go. And here I can change my roughness. Now, something that is specular roughness of 0 is going to be very, very shiny because there's no roughness on that surface. If I turn the roughness up, it adds sort of imperfections to that surface, and it reduces sort of the sharpness of the specular shine. We can also change our refractive index. Now, this is set to 1.3 by default, and this is actually very, very sensitive. You can do a Google search and find the refractive indexes on Wikipedia for most materials, and I actually really encourage you to get a sense of what those are, especially if you're trying to render something like glass or a gemstone or saliva or slime, because the refractive index can have a huge influence on how well those things actually generate. So I'm going to leave this to, I'm going to set it to 1.32, and I'm going to turn my spec roughness down a little bit so we get a little bit more of a wetness on that skin. Now I can change my specular. Right now the 100% is white. That's typically very, very shiny. I can leave that as it is, or we could paint a specular map to plug in there just by clicking the button here and then plugging a spec map in there. But for our purposes, we don't really need to tweak that. We can adjust the roughness and the refractive index. So let's go back up here to our translucency, and I want this creature to be a little bit more translucent, so we'll turn that up. All right, so now let's put another material on there. I want to put a material on the outer shell of the eyes. So go back to my material, and these are all in alphabetical order. If I go to glass, expand this, there's basic glass, and right here I've got glass basic. Now I could click and drag this over here. It's a little tricky. You got to make sure that you get the right object, but there, that worked out quite nicely. I have now put that clear glass on top, or on the shell, which is on the outer eye. So now I can see the cornea and the pupil underneath in the iris. So I can see all the eye detail there. And we've got a nice clear glass reflection. So now we should take a look at our lighting controls. If I go to lighting, we're right now set to basic. If I go to product, it's going to change the look of this render. Product is going to give us a slightly more accurate refraction. It's going to give us a more accurate look to our glass and our global illumination. We can go to interior, and this is going to adjust things, as you can see already, our translucency. The reaction of the translucency changes, as well as the glass. And then there's jewelry, which for the most part would be your highest settings. Usually I use either interior or jewelry when I'm trying to get a nice render of something. So this has changed the reactivity of my translucency. I'll double click the skin again, and I'll just drop this back down to 2. You can set these sliders very, very high. You can set them well beyond the distance of the slider itself. You can type in direct numbers there. We can also go back to our textures, and if I double click the skin texture here, this is the RGB that's controlling the skin. I can change the brightness and the contrast. If I wanted to adjust the contrast of the color map, I can do that by turning that up. I could also turn the brightness of it up if I wanted to do some tweaking of the poly paint here inside of Keyshot. I'm going to set these back to their original values. Now let's go back to our scene, and we'll find our outer shell. Now the best way I find to sort of figure out what is just turning off visibility on all of these and then turning things back on one at a time. So there's some eyelashes there. Sometimes the pop-up of the turntable isn't as fast as I would like it to be. So if I'm having a hard time finding like the glass shells, there's the glass shells for the eyes there, for example. So if I select that and go to my materials, that gives me my material information. Go to the properties, that gives me my properties on there. I can turn this up and down. We can add this to a render layer here. We can edit the material by clicking Edit Material. If I turn the eyeball back on, everything comes back into visibility. So let's change the material on the teeth. So if I were to go back over here to my translucent materials. Now, this can be a little tricky to get the teeth, to drag a material over to the teeth. I'm going to go to the translucent wax. So let's see, it's this one here. There we go, that's a good one, the translucent 100 millimeter. Now, if I click and drag this and then try and get it right on the teeth, you can kind of see when it's going to work. And then if I hold down the Alt key, it will update. Or I could just manually drag it over here to the list and drop it onto an object like so. The important thing to remember is that you're holding down the Alt key when you assign it. Otherwise, it's going to overwrite the poly paint. So we'll double click that, and then we'll go into our textures. Let's upgrade to the new node and disable the matte cap on that material. There we go. And then we will go to our properties. And I want this to be very shiny, so we'll leave our spec roughness down at 0. And our refractive index, I am going to turn it up just a little bit here. And I'm going to go to my translucency and set this to 0.6. There we go. Now, Keyshot is very, very easy to use, as you've probably already can tell. It gives you wonderful results right out of the box. You just need to know how to apply your materials and how to adjust your settings. So if I go back to my camera is locked. Go to my lighting. Here I've got my, or excuse me, go to my environment. Here I've got my environment lighting. I can actually store different environments here. So if I were to click one of these buttons, I can duplicate the environment. create a blank environment map, or add a camera in Environment Studio, I'm going to just duplicate this environment. This will be environment 2. But now what I'm going to do is change this environment by going to my environment maps, and let's go to a studio. We'll click Studio, and I'll just grab, let's say, this 3-point dark 4K. Drop that into the background, and that's going to update the environment in Environment 2. So I can have multiple environments stored inside of Keyshot. So I can do a studio lighting environment, I can do an outdoor environment, I could do that warehouse environment. You don't have to just have one set up. You can have multiples. And here we go. Now we've got the studio lighting set up. So I can take my Control key and click drag on the background, or I can rotate like this. Sometimes it gives a little flash of that previous environment as you're rotating. And what I want to do is I want to get my lighting. So I've got a nice key on the creature and a little bit of a soft fill in the background. So here we're starting to get something close to what we want. There we go. Now, I don't want to see those lights in the background. So in background, I'll turn on color, and I will change my color to, let's say, like a 50% gray, dark gray background. Click OK, and that's a far better background in my opinion than seeing the actual lighting environment. I can also click my lights here and change them and adjust them. If I go to the HDRI editor, I can turn off the lights here. So let's say I want to move this light. Now, because we rotated the creature and we didn't move our camera to go off, and when we first brought it in from ZBrush, your creature should be at about the center here. So I'm going to turn off the other 2 lights here, and that's going to give me just this light. Now I can move this light around and we can see it update on the surface. We can adjust it. We can move it up, move it down. If I were to move it, let's say, all the way over here, you see it's now coming from this side. Move it over here. There we go. I can have more precise movement by going to my azimuth here and elevation. I can do my left and right, and I can adjust my elevation like this. I can also change the radius of the light. I could change the color and the brightness. If I wanted this to be much, much brighter, I could turn the brightness up on this light here. Now I can turn on my other light, and that gives me this nice rim light here. And then I can turn on the overhead gradient, and that gives me a nice soft fill. And you see, as it just sits here rendering, it continually updates this image, and the quality improves as we let it sit. We're also casting shadows on the floor plane here. If I go back to my scene, go to our properties, I can snap the object to the ground. Also, if I go to the lighting controls here, I can control the lighting on the ground, I can control the shadow quality, and I can control the global illumination. So I've got control over all these settings here to determine how the shadow quality is rendered here inside of Keyshot. So just in the time that we've been sitting here talking, you're seeing the render has actually improved quite a bit. So let's take a look at some other things that we can do in Keyshot. We can create a turntable if you're using the full version of Keyshot by opening the animation control here. So first off, let's take a look at how we render, and then we'll take a look at doing an animation. So if I go to the top of the screen here and go to Render and open up the Render menu, I can do a one-off render just by using the still image control here. So what I will do is I will set the folder where my render will be saved. It defaults to the Keyshot folder, but I'm going to actually change this to the folder where I'm saving all the files for you in this particular lesson, so you'll be able to pull these up and open them. So let's go to Zbrush To Keyshot, Tools, and I'll create a new folder off screen here. So I've created a renders folder now. So we'll save the renders to this folder. Click Open. Now my format will be PSD, and I'll include an alpha. My resolution is 1920 by 1080. Now, this is great. If I open layers and passes, I can do all render layers, and that will render a diffuse, or excuse me, all render passes. That will do a diffuse, do a lighting pass, global illumination, ambient occlusion, and a clown pass, so we can get the individual subtools rendered out as flat color. This is something that we talk about in the ZBrush to Photoshop lecture, and we talk about this in the rendering, ZBrush rendering lecture. These types of compositing passes are incredibly helpful when you want to get your final imagery out. Very, very rarely, if ever, is the final image what's produced in the renderer. It's always composited and tweaked and graded. And having render passes like this allows you to do that. Now, this is important. If you do render your passes, turn on Add to PSD, because otherwise it will export an EXR, and Photoshop is notoriously difficult with opening EXR files. I'm just going to expand this window out a bit, and there we go. So now I'm just going to close this window. That gives me, all those settings are set in there. It's perfectly fine. As I'm working, if I turn on region, I have this region control. So if I want to change my region and sort of troubleshoot just one area, I can do this and then turn up my CPU usage to 100% maybe, or 99%, and then I can just render one area to see what I'm going to get. Then if I turn region off, I get the full render again. So that's nice for while you're testing different materials and different settings. You can also, as you might have noticed in that render menu, set a region for the render if you just want to set a region. But I've never had occasion to do a final render of just a region. As you are working, as I said before, Keyshot is updating as you go. So you see it is updating here. If you want to save a screenshot, there's a very handy screenshot button here. And if you click that, it will save, and it tells you right there it saved it in the Keyshot folder, renders, in the renders folder. So it's nice to be able to save your screenshots out like that. Now I'm going to go to cameras. Now we've got the untitled camera here. We've got our shot camera, which I seem to have misspelled. So let's unlock that and respell that shot, S-H-O-T. And then we'll lock it again. So I am going to go to render, add to queue. So that is now adding this render with this camera and this environment to the render queue. So there's a little add to queue thing here. Now what this is really doing is it's saving a Keyshot file in the Keyshot folder. So if you have a large Keyshot file, it may take a bit of time. And if you add a bunch of things to the queue and then don't render them, they are sitting on your hard drive. So be aware that it can eat up space until you process the render queue. So we'll go to our environments again. Now remember we had that other environment. If I select that environment, now we've got our outdoor environment. And for this one, let's say we want to change our background on this. So we'll go to our settings. And we've got our lighting environment. We could set it to a black backplate image if we wanted to import a backplate image, or we could set this as well to a color. I don't really ever want a stark white background, and this will be composited anyway, so the background doesn't particularly matter. But we'll put a backdrop on here. So this is using the outdoor lighting. You see we have this nice green and blue reflected light here. So now I will go to render, add to queue. Now, if I go back to the rendering menu, once it's completed adding to queue, so it's saving this. Like I said, every time I add a new scene to the queue, it's saving a copy of my Keyshot file. So be aware of that. Be very aware of that if you add a bunch of things to the queue. I use the queue all the time because I never can decide what angle I want to use. So I'll render a few different ones, and then I'll just process the queue and walk away, and then come back a few hours later and decide which ones I like. So I'm going to bring the render menu back over. Now I've got my global settings here, the name and the place where these are going to be stored. So it's storing in my Intro to ZBrush 2021 folder. I'm saving as PSD with an alpha. I have my 1920 by 1080 resolution, 300 DPI, so it is print quality. I'm rendering all render passes. Now some of these aren't going to be necessary, and for example, you might not find that you're going to use the normals pass, for example, but I still render it just in case I have a use for it. Always turn on add to PSD. Now if I go to queue, here you see I've got my two different images. These are my two different files. I've got the resolution set. Now all I have to do to execute this render is click the process queue button down here at the bottom, And Process Q will start to render both of those images. It'll open up a separate window, which you're not going to be able to see on the screen right now because it opens on a separate window. And because I have Keyshot maximized, I can't pull it over. But I don't want you to sit here for 30 minutes and watch these renders go. So I will stop the recording and we'll come back when they're completed and then take a look at the result. So now that render has completed, and if we look over here, I'm going to open up the folder where I've stored those renders. You can see that we've got a series of files that Keyshot has produced. It's produced a depth pass as an EXR, and it's produced 2 PSD files. Now, if we go to Photoshop, I've opened those PSD files, and you can see what we get. We get an RGBA layer. That's just our collapsed render, and then we have render passes here. If I turn on visibility on this, these are those passes that we selected when we checked the Render All Passes button. We have a clown pass, which allows us to very easily lasso select any particular object, for example, the eyes or the head itself. We could also do a selection by going to Select Color Range, and we can select based on color range using this. We have the raw render here. Label, ambient occlusion. Now, ambient occlusion is a shadow pass. We have the shadow pass here. We have a refraction pass, which if we zoom in here, you can see that that is going to be useful for the eyes. Reflection, which is essentially a specular pass. We can use that for the specular highlight on the eyes and on the skin. If we zoom out on this, you can see that more easily. Caustics, which in this case we don't have anything in that pass, and global illumination. Then we have a raw lighting pass, a diffuse color pass, and the normals pass. Now, you could turn on things like shadow, for example, and then set that particular layer to a multiply blending mode, and that'll sort of punch up the shadows on the render, and then we can dial back the opacity on that. We can also use our clown pass here. We do a magic wand select on the background, we can knock the background out of this render here and out of our shadow pass, and then we can add a custom background here. So if I were to create a new layer, Control-Shift-N and call it background, then we could fill this with 50% gray. So let's go ahead and select a 50% gray here, and Control-A to select all, and then Alt-Delete to fill with that gray, and we'll put that at the bottom. So now we've got a nice background. I could turn on the ambient occlusion layer, and once again, that's a shadow pass, so we'd set that to multiply, and we can adjust the opacity to have total control over that particular shadow layer. So this is really handy for being able to tweak and fine-tune your imagery coming out of Keyshot. So anytime I do a render, I always do those render passes, so I've got total control over all these different elements. Now, if I wanted to create a new render pass, perhaps I wanted to do a render of just gray, I've got my camera stored. I can change my materials in Keyshot to another render. Because my camera is stored and my image resolution is stored, it will lay on top of this in the exact right orientation. So we can continue to do multiple passes out of Keyshot to Photoshop. Now, I've saved the Keyshot file for the download, so you can download this, and you can also download these PSD files so you can have the layered PSD and see what was produced. Now I'd like to talk about the live link between ZBrush and Keyshot. If we go back to Keyshot, Keyshot gives you this save reminder. I just saved, so I won't need to save again, but that's a nice little feature that it will constantly remind you about saving. So remember that we scaled our object and moved it, and we assigned materials. If I go back to ZBrush now, and let's make a change to our character. Let's perhaps add another subtool. I will append a polymesh star in. So now we have a polymesh star. I'll select that subtool, and let's just change this into perhaps a polysphere. I'll add a subdivision level to it. Now I've added a new subtool, and let's just move it off to the side so it's not sitting right there in the head. Now, if I do the BPR button again, if I press that again, I still have Keyshot turned on. So what it will do is it will take all of these tools and then once again export them to Keyshot. So it is converting it over to the Keyshot windows. If we bring Keyshot back up, you see it's merging parts and it's bringing everything back in. And here we go. Keyshot has maintained those scale and rotation changes that we applied to the model group ZBrush, but it has brought in that new subtool. So if I were to make changes to one of my existing subtools, or if I were to add new subtools and then send it back to Keyshot, the Keyshot to ZBrush bridge will live link and update my current Keyshot scene file. Now, if I go to my scene here, right there is the sphere. If I turn visibility off on it, I can hide it. If I right-click on it, I could duplicate it. I could add it to a render layer, which is handy if you want to have different render layers for different accessories or costume elements. We could also move just this individual object by clicking Move. It'll bring up the Move gizmo. I could also lock this or hide and lock. If I lock it, then it cannot be changed at all. I could also delete it, which is what I want to do. I want to get rid of that. So let's go ahead and delete that sphere. Now, before we talk about animation in Keyshot, I want to mention scale. As we've already seen, we had to do some rescaling on this character. It is possible to send scaled objects from ZBrush to Keyshot, and that uses a plugin. If we go back over to ZBrush, if I go to the Z plugin menu, here you'll find there is a plugin called Keyshot Scale Sender. Now, what this does is it sends the tool over to Keyshot at its actual scale, not the ZBrush scale. Now, we have a video on Scale Master. If you have not watched that yet, I'd recommend taking a look at it so you really understand the idea of scale inside of ZBrush. So I'm going to delete this subtool that we added, the sphere. Click OK. And I'll go to the largest subtool, which is the Bogey Lady head itself. There. Now I'm going to open up Scale Master, and I'm going to set my scene scale, and this is going to allow me to establish the overall size of this character. This is an X, Y, Z, so in my Y direction, I think 2.45 feet would be reasonable. I actually think from the middle of her chest to the top of her head would be higher than that, but we can change that. So I've set it to 2.45 feet in the Y direction. I'm going to go ahead and set that. I think that would be probably, I imagine the Bogey Lady to be quite tall. So let's set that to 3.5. And let's go ahead and resize subtool. We have all turned on, so it's resizing everything to that size. It goes through each subtool, changes the scale relative to the other tools, and then repositions everything. So we're storing that scale factor in ZBrush. So what we can do now, instead of sending, for example, if I use the ZBrush Scale Unify to scale everything down to the ideal ZBrush scale, which is 2 brush units. Instead of sending this size over to Keyshot, we can send the actual object size, which is 3.5 feet tall, to Keyshot instead. Now, we go into this in much more depth in the chapter on Scale Master, but I just wanted to give you some context before we use this plugin, the Keyshot Scale Sender. Now, Keyshot Scale Sender is not pre-installed with ZBrush. This is something that you have to grab from the Pixelogic website. It is free, so you can download this and install it. It's very easy to install ZBrush plugins. All you need to do is extract them into your ZBrush install folder. So if I open that now, I'll go to Applications, and then I'll open up ZBrush 2021, and then I will bring this over to the screen so you can see it. In the ZBrush 2021 install folder, I have a Z Startup folder. Inside of Z Startup, I have Z Plugs 64. So any plugin that you download is going to consist of a ZSC file and a folder. So I put the ZSC and folder in the Z Plugs 64 folder. Don't put them in a subfolder. You can't make a new folder in here and then put them inside there. ZBrush won't read them. That's a nice way to disable plugins, actually. If you think it might be causing a problem, you can isolate it in a subfolder and ZBrush won't read it. So anytime you download a plugin from Pixelogic, you would put it in here. So let's go ahead and try the ZBrush, the Send Scale to Keyshot button. So what I do is I have rescaled this to 2 brush units, but it still maintains the object scale of 3.5 feet in Y. So if I click Send Scaled Tool to Keyshot, what it will do is it will go through all of my subtools. It's going to ask me, the selected subtool has a generic size units of blah, 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 choose the closest one. So it's 3.5 feet. Select that. Now you see it goes through and rescales each subtool up to that original size. Now remember I said that scale is something that can have a lot of impact on rendering, especially with translucent materials and your environment, because when we were in Keyshot earlier, we had to change our environment size. So the file has been sent to Keyshot in units resembling feet. So when we get to Keyshot, we're going to set our units to feet, and we're going to resize the environment using the size slider. We have already sized it down, so when we get over to Keyshot, we'll probably find that that environment is too small. So let's go back over to Keyshot. It's merging parts and bringing the objects in now. And there you see it has brought the object in and scaled it up. You saw the scale just change there. If I go to File, or excuse me, Edit, Set Scene Units, Feet, we can now set our scene scale to feet. Click OK and continue. And if I go back to my environment, go to our settings, let's change back to our environment that has the park field here so we can actually see something. And we'll change to the lighting environment for our background, and we'll change our size back to its default setting. Now you see the character in relation to the background is much more reasonable. And when we change our scale this way, I do find that it has some impact on things such as translucency and shadows and lighting inside of Keyshot. So there's a lot of value to being aware of what your object scale is when you're sending it over. If I were sending over a full figure, a biped, I would probably try and set the size to something comparable to 6 feet, be that in feet or in meters. If we go back to our environment now, and let's go to our interior, and we'll grab that warehouse once again, put that warehouse in there. You see, whereas before the character was very, very small compared to the background, now it's a lot more realistic in terms of the size differential between the character and the background. You also see that our framing has changed, so we need to go to our camera, unlock that camera, and then zoom out so our framing once again lines up. Then I would lock that camera again. I'd save the camera. That's one sort of nuance with Keyshot, an idiosyncrasy. You have to save the camera after you make a change and then lock it again. So I find having a consistent scale is very, very helpful when going from ZBrush to Keyshot. And that plugin, the Keyshot Scale Sender, is really, really helpful for doing that. So it will scale your object, send it over, and then scale it back down to the 2 brush unit scale that we see here. If we go to Geometry, open up Size, it's 1.98. This is quite close to 2, as close to 2 as it can get. And again, we talk about all of this in much more depth in the Scale Master chapter, which by this point you've probably watched, but I just want to point you in that direction in case you skipped it, because there is a lot of important stuff to understand about scale and ZBrush, especially with the addition of dynamics. This is particularly susceptible to object scale. So in closing, let's go back over to Keyshot and take a look at doing turntables. Now, we have a whole video on rendering turntables and time-lapse videos out of ZBrush using the movie timeline here. We can do turntables. As you see, we can render a turntable out of ZBrush, and we talk about that in depth. But in Keyshot, we can render turntables as well. And it's very, very simple to do. And this is going to be something you do with the full version of Keyshot. It's not in every version. So if you don't have this animation button down here, it may be that you're using a version of Keyshot that doesn't have animation. If you do, it's the simplest thing in the world. Simply click Animation Wizard, select Turntable, and this will gives you the rotation of a cube to show you what you're going to get. Click Next. Select your model set. I'm going to rotate around the ZBrush model set. Click Next, and then it gives me the degrees. I'm going to do 360 degrees around the center of the model. I could do clockwise or counterclockwise. Then we can see our times. I leave the time settings as they are. The motion ease, I can ease in and ease out. This is kind of nice. You can start and then slowly begin the turntable and then slow down, or you can just have it be linear, which is just one continuous turntable. So there is a nice ability to alter your motion there. Click Finish, and then it will generate the keyframes for you. So I'll turn on performance mode so we're not getting any rendering right now. And then I can just click play, and it's going to give me a preview of that rotation. So we get a nice turntable for our character. So I'll stop that just by clicking play again, and we'll go back to our first keyframe here. Now, if I want to render this, if I go to my image settings, and you see remember that I was set to 1920 by 1080, that is HD. So if I go to the render menu, open up render, go to my output. Now, if I go to animation, here I can control my animation settings. So it's 1920 by 1080. I've got a variety of presets here, so I can change that. I'll do the entire duration of my timeline. I can set it to video output, so this will be Bogey Lady Render Keyshot, and I'm going to store it in, this is defaulting to the Keyshot folder once again, so what I will do is I will browse to the folder where I want to store these, which is going to be here. I'll put it in the renders folder. Click open. And I'll just leave the file name as it is. Now you can output the individual frames if you want to, and you could output the render layer passes if you wanted to. And I'll turn off add to PSD because we're not actually rendering out the render passes. We can set our format. I've got it set to MOV H.264. And then if you want to render that turntable animation, all you need to do is just click render. I could also add this to the queue, so I could render a series of still images and also render my animation. So I could set everything up. When it's all ready to go, I could click process queue and then go to bed for the evening and come back, and everything would be ready in the morning. So when I click render, it will begin to process those frames, and it will create the video from those final rendered frames. Now this will take quite a bit of time. It's not something that I'm going to stay on camera and show you. We'll pause this and come back and then play the resulting video back so you can see what we get. Incidentally, your preview window here is zoomed in. If I click and drag out, I can see the full rendered frame this way. So don't be concerned if it's cropped in like that. That's just a crop view. You can zoom back out. So I will stop the recording now, and we will come back when this is complete. And here we have our final render turntable. So Keyshot is a really fantastic tool for taking your models out of ZBrush, getting very high quality renders, utilizing all your painting and all of your material setups from ZBrush if you choose to, or replacing them here in Keyshot. And there's so much more that we can talk about when it comes to Keyshot, and I'll go over that in a different lesson, in a different video series in the future. But this should be enough to get you started. And again, you'll need a seat of Keyshot for this to work, and you'll need the ZBrush to Keyshot bridge, which is not very expensive. It is a separate plugin from Pixelogic. And I encourage you, if you're doing a lot of rendering and compositing, that it's probably worth checking out. Like I said, it's really a core element of my own personal workflow is using Keyshot in conjunction with ZBrush. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.